Hi, everyone, and welcome to CMNCP22, the annual conference of the Canadian Municipal Network on Crime Prevention. My name is Leigh, and I work for CMNCP. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I am joining you from Hamilton, which is situated on the traditional territories of the Erie, Neutral, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Mississaugas. Thank you all for joining us for this year's conference, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our session, Sex Work is Work, Local Innovations of Sex Work Safety. This session will be moderated by Frances Shaver and will include presentations by Sandra, Wesley, Elene, Leigh, Elliot, and Nadia, Grutter. Because we want to make sure that each panelist has enough time for their presentation and that we have an opportunity for some questions at the end, I won't be reading out the full bios of our moderator and panelists, but we do encourage you to refer to our website where we have the full biographies of our amazing presenters. And without further ado, I'm pleased to welcome our moderator for the session, Frances Shaver. Frances is a retired sociologist from Concordia University in Montreal and has conducted research on the sex industry for 35 years. Thank you for agreeing to take part in this session, and I'll hand it over to you to start our conversation and introduce our first presenter.
Hi there. Welcome, and thank you very much for the introduction. I'm speaking today from Vancouver, the unceded and ancestral territory of the Hunkaminam and the Shohoamish-speaking peoples, a territory which has been stewarded by them since time immemorial. Our panelists represent three different organizations by and for sex workers: Leigh, Elliot, and Nadia Grutter from Peers Resource Society in Victoria, Elene Lamb from Butterfly, an Asian and Migrant Sex Workers Network in Toronto, and Sandra Wesley from Stella, L'Ami de Mamie in Montreal. Each will have 15 minutes to speak, leaving a good half hour for our Q&A session in the end. But first, a brief introduction. This brief introduction begins with some definitions. And the first definition I just wanted to mention is about sex work itself, which involves consenting adults exchanging sexual services for money or goods. Another important issue is sexual services themselves. They may include a provision of sexual gratification using fantasy, as in exotic dancing, phone or internet sex, and direct physical contact, as is most often the case with escorts, masseuses, and street-based workers. Diversity is an important key to understanding the sex industry. The industry is diverse. Street-based work is the most visible, but the majority of sex work, 80 to 90%, takes place in private venues, including escort agencies, massage parlors, hotels and motels, clients' residences, sex workers' homes and workspaces, and online. It's organized in a variety of different ways. In-call, which is a fixed location where the workers receive clients. Out-call, and this is the case where sex workers will go to the client's home, business, or hotel room, and they might work independently for themselves or with colleagues, or they might work for someone else, an owner or a manager, for example, of an agency or an escort service. And you can combine those four categories in several different ways as well. One of the really important things to recognize is that sex workers themselves are diverse. They come from different backgrounds, encompassing a range of ages, sexual orientations, gender expressions, education and income levels, as well as racial and ethnic backgrounds. The majority identify as women, including both cisgendered and trans women. However, men, and trans men are also involved in the industry. People enter the industry for many different reasons, although periods of financial need or outright poverty are often key drivers. They are not the only drivers. Many choose this work for the autonomy and flexibility it affords. That is, the ability to choose when and where to work, who they work with, and how much money they may earn each week. Still others see the industry as an opportunity to explore their sexuality, to validate their desirability, or to be part of something that defies social sexual norms and values. And work experience are also diverse. For example, some experience arrest, violence, and theft, and others are much less likely to have these experiences. Some use illegal drugs, and others don't use them at all. Some are able to work quite safely and securely, but others are less able to work that way. But they all share some experiences with discrimination and stigma. Current laws criminalize a number of activities and people. Sex workers who communicate in public are criminalized. All clients who obtain or try to obtain sexual services are criminalized. And third parties, including sex workers, are criminalized. They're criminalized if they receive material benefit. That is some kind of compensation related to someone else's sexual services. They're criminalized if they are or facilitate procuring, meaning they are involved in the purchase of someone else's sexual services. And they're criminalized if they advertise someone else's sexual services. These laws have a number of negative effects. They most certainly negatively affect the health, safety, and security of sex workers, and they undermine sex workers' rights under the Charter. In short, they make it very difficult to work safely and securely. This is especially true for vulnerable and marginalized populations, such as visible minorities, Indigenous women, trans people, immigrants, the extremely poor, and those with substance use problems. There are some pretty straightforward solutions. First and foremost, working conditions will improve if these laws are struck down. In addition, we will still need to work on dismantling the stigma and resulting discrimination that sex workers experience. I have a number of questions, and I look forward to hearing from the panelists and the audience as I continue to struggle with these questions. What can we do right now to increase the safety and security and well-being of sex workers? What can we do right now to dismantle the stigma and discrimination associated with sex work? And what can we do in the long term to improve the safety, security, and well-being of sex workers? I invite you to identify your own questions and to help us consider some needed answers during the Q&A at the end of the session. Our first panelists, Leigh, Elliot, and Nadia Grutter, are from Peers Victoria Resources Society. Peers is an organization working to create a safe, supportive, and non-judgmental environment for sex workers. Leigh and Nadia, you're up.
Thank you, Frances. Hi, everyone. My name is Nadia, and I'm the Violence Prevention Team Lead from Victoria, Peers Victoria, here with Leigh, our Operations Manager. Before we jump in, I'd like to take a moment to recognize that we're both calling in from the stolen Songhees and Esquimalt land. In violence prevention, especially, we witness the devastating impacts of ongoing colonialism and try to work with community in a good way to increase safety for sex workers, especially people made most vulnerable by colonial law. Yeah, I'll pass it over to Leigh to share more about Peers.
Thanks, Nadia. So just briefly, Peers Victoria has been providing outreach, harm reduction, and education services for people in the sex industry for more than 25 years. It is an innovative multi-service grassroots agency established by, with, and for sex workers in 1995. Through direct service delivery and community partnerships, Peers provides an array of outreach and drop-in harm reduction and support services alongside education and employment training for current and former sex workers in Victoria and on Vancouver Island. So Nadia and I could talk about Peers for hours, but we only have 15 minutes. So Nadia and I decided it'd be a good idea to give a brief overview of the community-based projects, partnerships, and initiatives that Peers engages in to support sex worker safety in Victoria, BC. So firstly, we are very fortunate to have a city council and mayor who support what we do here at Peers. So for example, in 2014, they wrote a letter to Stephen Harper declaring their stance that Bill C-36, now known as PACIPA, or the Protection of Communities and Exploited Persons Act, not be made into law. So those were the areas of criminalization for sex workers and third-party sex workers that Fran just briefly described in her introduction there. PACIPA criminalizes aspects of the sex trade that make it more difficult for sex workers to work safely. So I'm just going to read a section of that letter to you now. In recent years, the City of Victoria has worked with Peers, the Victoria Police Department, and Vancouver Island Health Authority, along with researchers at the University of Victoria, to consider and address factors that promote the health and safety of people involved in the industry. The City of Victoria Mayor and Council shares Peers' concern that Bill C-36, as proposed by the current federal government, will cause harm to sex workers by discouraging collaborative relationships with police, health providers, and social service organizations. Criminalizing the industry further, as envisioned by Bill C-36, will increase the dangers for sex workers and exploited youth by forcing the industry deeper into the shadows and destroying the positive collaborative connections built among sex workers. We support the constitutional rights of sex workers as we would any other Victoria residents, and champion community approaches that promote equal and full access to justice, harm reduction, and health prevention resources. So as much as PACIPA has come into law, this written support we have received from our mayor and council in 2014 is met to this day with inclusion and collaboration. They take part in our programming, events, and education initiatives, and we take part in roundtable discussions and initiatives around building an inclusive city. The letter also mentions our collaborative relationship with the Victoria Police Department. So I'm going to speak about that just a little briefly here. So since around 2010, we've had a liaison relationship with the Victoria Police Department that has changed and how it has looked over the years. It changes and fluctuates depending on who is in the liaison role and what leadership is currently involved at VicPD. The relationship is only made possible because VicPD has verbally stated to us that their priority is the health and safety of sex workers and that they would rarely consider enforcement. Although I feel it is important to clarify that they have not made any written statement to this effect, and thus it is very important that we are verbally and communicating with them at all times to discuss their relationship with sex workers. It is also a relationship we have pursued because a liaison officer is seen as beneficial by some members of our community, although there are some sex workers who are against this relationship as well. However, we strive to offer as much choice as possible for our participants and to make the reporting process, should they choose to go in that direction, as safe as possible and as destigmatizing as possible. This relationship has allowed us to open a channel of communication between our organization and VicPD's, so that when issues arise, either in terms of safety concerns for sex workers or if their policing strategies are negatively impacting sex workers, we can have conversations to hopefully address that. This relationship with VicPD has developed as a result of a voice need for the community to have safer and less stigmatizing options for reporting. Although the relationship has changed over the years, some key aspects remain the same. So the first is that there is a police liaison for Peers that staff and participants are able to connect with regarding any concerns or questions on policing and sex work, violence prevention and response, bad date reporting, etc. 2, the police liaison will come into Peers in plain clothes to meet with a participant who wants to ask questions or make a report with one of our violence prevention team members in the room. So some sex workers find that they don't want to go into police stations because they've had bad experiences in the past. And that can be a very traumatizing experience for them. They feel more comfortable here. So the liaison officer will come in plain clothes and sit in a room here to take a report for them with one of our violence prevention team members in the room. So Nadia is one of those team members. The third is workshops and training. I will put the caveat in place here that because of COVID for the last couple of years, we have not been doing this, but we're looking at starting it up again in January. So this involves Peers staff will go to VicPD and present on Peers' services. and do sex work myth busting for patrol members and other relevant police departments. As well, the liaison will come into Piers' drop-in center and do workshops and answer questions around reporting for sex workers here at our drop-in center. The liaison receives an edited version of the bad date and aggressor report, which Nadia is going to talk about briefly after I'm done here. Certain aspects are taken out, and they will liaise with the violence prevention team about any connections or leads that they're able to find from the report. And lastly, a couple of years ago, we did some research and documentation on our liaison relationship and interviewed sex workers, police officers, as well as peers, staff members, to talk about the history of the liaison relationship and to talk about recommendations for moving it forward. And after that report came out, we've been having quarterly stakeholder meetings for the last year and a half to discuss improvements to the relationship to better serve sex workers in our community. And we are currently in the process of recruiting for our sex worker advisory committee that will go over the meeting notes from these stakeholder meetings, as well as the report, and oversee and approve any recommendations or action items to ensure that our work is constantly reflecting the needs of the community. And I'm going to pass it over to Nadia now to talk a bit more about our bad date reporting and other connections and collaborations in the community.
Awesome. Thank you, Leigh. So our violence prevention and response team is predominantly responsible for sex work or occupational health and safety. And the touchstone of our programming is bad date and aggressor reporting, which is based in existing mechanisms of street-based community care, which is sometimes referred to as whisper networking. So basically, we aim to discreetly share information about targeted violence against sex workers within and around people working in the sex industry. So what that looks like is sex workers can anonymously report descriptions of aggressors and incidents to our team 7 days a week on our night outreach van, which goes to the local stroll in Victoria, at drop-in, at our drop-in center, online, or with any peer staff working in any peers programming, which is effectively nearly every low barrier social service in the city, like everywhere since the beginning of the pandemic. Reporters can then choose whether or not they would like follow-up support, which includes optional police reporting, and referrals to internal or external wraparound services. So internally, we offer harm reduction and overdose prevention, basic needs provision, various group supports, education and response, counseling, clinic and health access, Indigenous peer and elder support, and training for opening small businesses and working in harm reduction. Janelle Smith is trying to access the website. The partially redacted reports are then published on our online password protected database and sent out via email and text to anyone signed up to receive our bad day reports, which includes, like Leigh said, our police liaison officer, other social service organizations, independent sex workers, allies, and agencies. We also print out condensed bad date reports in discrete pamphlets for in-person access, which is mostly how people access the information on our night outreach van and then drop in. It does feel important to note that we accept reports not only of bad dates, but of violence against sex workers outside of work, because violence against sex workers disproportionately intersects with violence against people made vulnerable by colonialism. So that, like Francis was saying, that includes trans, non-binary, and two-spirit people, Indigenous people, people who are unhoused, use substances, and are disabled and or immigrants or migrants. And the reported circumstances we find and aggressor descriptions are overwhelmingly similar in both those cases. Another huge part of prevention involves ongoing intercommunity relationship building. Most recently, we worked with various organizations across so-called Victoria during the emergency sheltering of unhoused people throughout the first 4 waves of the pandemic, and we still are. During this time of intensely heightened community need, we had to work closely with housing providers, medical teams, other harm reduction organizations, public health home support organizations, bylaw, hotel staff, police, neighborhood houses, and security staff. The resulting relationships have made it possible for us to meaningfully engage with a variety of people in the city regarding stigma reduction and myth busting, which is now a significant part of our work as well. So we offer, I'd say like 40% of our work is offering educational workshops for safety for sex workers, gender-based violence, intimate partner violence, bystander intervention, and lateral violence in oppressed communities. And our curriculum development is deeply informed by paid participant contribution. Yeah, we're also involved in the development of the BC VDAR, which is a bad date reporting tool that the aim is to be used across British Columbia to improve safety for the most vulnerable sex workers in the province. And in that work, we're really lucky to work alongside other sex worker-led and allied organizations to create a system altogether, which has been amazing. Yeah, and what we hope for within this kind of community programming under criminalization is to combat public stigma with education, reach more people with more relevant preventative information, and provide multi-tiered safety options, informed and represented by sex workers as far as possible. So, yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Nadia and Leigh. There are some very interesting things to start considering built into that presentation. And I even have a couple of questions to go on that myself. Okay, so our next speaker is Elene Lamb. She is the founder of Butterfly, and Butterfly is based in Toronto and provides support to and advocates for the rights of Asian and migrant sex workers. So Elene, you have a moment to start right now.
Hi, everyone. Can you see me? Okay, amazing. Thank you so much. And thank you. This is really my honor to able to join here. And I think that this would be great. Thank you so much. I have a chance to share some of the work of Butterfly and also some of the issue faced by the community. And of course, safety is a very, very important issue. But I think for Butterfly, safety is not only not being robbed, raped, or being killed, right? Safety is about how to not being discriminated. Safety is about how to be respected in the society. And so, and I think before we jump to talk about what Butterfly do to support the safety of the community, I would like to talk about what is the barrier actually make the sex worker cannot be safe. And thank you, Francine, already like give the overview about like how the law actually make sex worker unsafe. And I will talk more about specifically related to migrant sex worker. And I would like to share the screen. Can you see my screen? Yes, so as I said, like we start with the safety is about like never can separate with the justice, right? So that is like whether people is safe, is not only not being murdered, but is whether they also can, you know, enjoy the rights of other people, whether they can live freely. And so that the justice is very, very important starting point of Butterfly. And so this is a postcard, so safety, dignity, and justice. So, and so this is the content of Butterfly that feel free to reach out to us. And so Butterfly is a grassroots organization, so that we have a lot of direct support of the sex worker, including like hotline, outreach, and also the like crisis support, especially when people in the situation experience the violence, arrest, are detained, and deported. But majority and the major goal of Butterfly actually is building the community and building the leadership of the community. And actually the sex worker community already have done so much things to keep each other safe. But because of the law, it's make many of the support system become criminalized, as also like make the sex worker become the target of the violence. And so thank you. Both of you guys mentioned about like the criminalization of sex work, but for the migrant sex worker, that the challenge they face is including the immigration law, right? So even we hear that BC seems that the police is very like, you know, like using the approach not targeting sex worker. But we hear that migrant sex workers say that they are often being targeted by the law enforcement and the police, right? So that the immigration law is being used against the migrant sex worker, because now even people who have work permit, but the immigration policy is not allow people so do not allow any people with temporary temporary status to work in sex industry. For example, if they're refugee, if they under sponsorship, suppose they can work, right? But then they are not allowed to work in sex industry. It's give extra layer. And of course, like being migrant is already being taken away a lot of rights, because when they report to the police, they may not use sex work law to charge them. They may use the immigration law to charge them. And also the bylaw, and particularly with the racism against the Asian massage parlor, we see in last decade, the bylaw is often being used to target the Asian sex worker and massage worker. So, and the anti-trafficking policy, now we see how Canadian government and particularly Ontario government spend so much money, say, this is the anti-trafficking work, make women safe. But what happened? The anti-trafficking policy itself is the violence against sex worker, including like there is increased a lot of power of law enforcement, increase a lot of investigation for law enforcement that make the sex worker being arrested, and also surveillance and particular racial profile. And so, and now also a lot of exiting program that force sex worker to live in the sex industry. It is also the violence. We should remember like how the conversion therapy that is being seen as the violence against gay people force them to exit, like change their sexuality. And now the exiting program is no different. They just force sex worker, to quit the job. And so this is also the other kind of violence. So that's why, and so this is an image like also we web, like how the Asian migrant sex worker is being touched by many different law. And so when we talk about violence, so sex worker is facing different kind of violence, workplace violence, intimate partner violence, and also we do not mention a lot, but this is also the violence often faced by the sex worker, including the neighbor, the landlord, the banker, and the service provider also. This kind of perpetrator is often like target the sex worker in public space. So for example, we see that the people report the street-based sex worker to police. Why? It's because they just discriminate them. They don't like it. But then they think that they should not be exist here. They want to eliminate them. This is also a kind of like violence. And also is also a pipeline, bring in the police that harm the sex worker. And the state violence, particularly for the Asian and migrant sex worker, they are the major source of violence. So 60% of Butterfly members report that they have experienced different kind of violence of law enforcement. So that's why bringing more law enforcement in sex worker life do not make sex worker be safe. And I think the other caution is like, working with police is also something very dangerous because you don't know when they will flip the pawn. So for example, in Toronto, so there is a special victim unit. This unit is advocated by like the supporter of sex worker movement for so long. And so that they have been like working with the sex worker, like collect the information of perpetrator, and they are willing, like not charge the sex worker, but like investigate the crime against them. But this team is flipped to the anti-trafficking team. Immediately, they are turned into investigate of sex worker and their related activity. So that means all the information shared with this police will put the sex worker in danger, right? This is not only in Toronto, but we hear a lot of places. So that's why it is actually the protection when the sex worker do not trust the police because they know that they cannot be trusted. But I think as service provider and now have so many people like advocate to working with the police, and we always need to aware that is something very dangerous. We don't know whether the police liaison, the sex worker support unit, and they will when they turn in, crime investigation, like that is doing something harmful to the sex worker. Right? So this is our experience, and so that just like to share. That's why instead of relying on the police, the community has been using different way, to support each other and make each other safe, right? Including sex worker, client, like third party. They are very important support system, right? So like, for example, many Asian and migrant sex workers, they can't speak English, that they may need other sex workers to screen the client for them, right? And clients, some is good, some is bad. And we are often, like when sex workers have get into trouble, they may find other client to do translation for them or give them the right, to leave the dangerous situation, or even to help them to book the hotel room, right? So for example, some of the boss is not good, then the client may pay for the hotel, that they can book the room for them and they can work. But because of all the criminalization of sex work make it more difficult. And same as landlord, labor, and hotel, before we see them, actually is very supportive. But criminalization of sex work to create the opportunity that they can exploit the sex worker, right? Because they need to survive, these people, instead of protect them, they may use this opportunity to ask them for money. Even some people want to protect them. We have just a landlord want to rent a place for sex worker, but the police keep asking him to kick out the sex worker. Otherwise, you will get like by law charge or criminal charge by procuring, like supporting sex work activity, right? So that all this support system is being criminalized, make sex worker be dangerous. And one of the example is like Butterfly have been helping many sex worker of our members to do translation. So for example, when the client not pay or the client like stolen some stuff from the sex worker, that we will like reach out to that client, say like sometimes we know the workplace of the client and then we may call them. So like you should return the stuff, But now it's all criminalized, right? Even we help the worker to discuss about, the sexual service, it will be also like a charge. So that you see the support system is being criminalized. This is the image, particularly now the sex work is being conflated with human trafficking, particularly Asian and migrant, so that we want to emphasize sex work is not crime. Community support is not crime. And so when many cities talk about keep the safe, like the society safe, keep the city safe, and kick away sex worker and promote the hate of sex worker is one of the things they keep doing, right? Because they see the sex worker as public nuisance, they see the sex worker as the crime. So we see in so many like anti-trafficking initiative, they either find like the sex worker is the victim, they need to be rescued, or they are the criminal, they are the illegal activity in the city they need to get rid of, right? And particularly we see a lot of example how racialized people, and we work with Asian migrants, is being targeted and being kicked out. And the anti-trafficking become very powerful tools for many cities, impose a harmful policy against the sex worker. It's give the religion group and some of the anti-trafficking group, they are actually anti-sex work group, to use it to impose the violence on sex worker body. When you take away the agency, when you assume the sex worker cannot be consent, all of this actually is the violence against the sex worker. And this is often not being mentioned. And because they use the name of protecting sex worker, rescuing sex worker, and so that they get a lot of support, including funding. So this is one of the documents we explain how the document like 18 sex workers, how they are being arrested, detained, and deported. And this is one of the like image that how the sex worker talk about when the NGO and also the police say, I'm rescued the woman, but this is the experience of the worker. Actually, she was being arrested and detained. And this is other example, as I said, like Butterfly, a member said that like most of the major violence actually is from police. In the anti-trafficking investigation, they are often being locked up and the money being seized, phones being seized. This is a robbery, right? That the money being robbed by the law enforcement, sometimes on the record, sometimes without the record. So this is all the harm they are experienced by the anti-trafficking policy. So that's why when we think about safe, it's not sex worker safe from the perpetrator, but how the sex worker be safe from the state violence. And this is something what Butterfly has been doing in last few years to stop the violence from the state against the sex worker. And I see a lot of audience here today, so we really need you to support. And many of the protecting measure now, what we mentioned, what we hear actually is not really sex worker lead. Many protective measure advocated by some of the anti-trafficking group, anti-sex worker group actually make the sex worker be more dangerous. So, and
make sure to mute yourself. Microphone is open.
Okay, so and yeah, so that like people may remember. So last year have 6 Asian massage worker being murdered in Atlanta. People concerned about the anti-Asian racism, but it's very clear the perpetrator killed the sex worker is because the anti-sex work hate, right? So that is like also the homophobia make the sex worker. So, and then I want to show more pictures. So this is the bylaw review in Newmarket. You see how all this white, city councillor passed the bylaw that make all the Asian massage parlor being shut down in Newmarket. Now have none of the Asian massage parlor able continues to do because they imposed the credential. Only the people graduate from a Canadian, so only the people graduate from the Canadian education institution can get the license. But then it's like how white supremacy, how racism can be like imposed with the homophobia policy make the sex worker be dangerous because they cannot work anymore, right? And how the sex work and massage parlor being making illegal, that is like how the violence actually can impose and justify by the law enforcement is making the law, right? Criminalization, like Francine has mentioned, so that like makes sex worker activity become illegal. They can arrest them, they can take away the freedom, they can take away the money. And the bylaw is the same thing, how they make the like massage parlor work become illegal. They can like take away the money, shut down their business, and also charging the people. And so the other policy makes sex worker unsafe is like, for example, the bylaw in the massage parlor, many city, in order to give the power for law enforcement, they are not allowed to lock the door, right? Lock the door is a simple way people can screen the perpetrator and protect themselves. But if they do it, they will get charged. They will be illegal. And so that's why as the resistance, what we need to do, so like in order to take away the barrier, the community can support each other to protect each other's safety. So that we need to push back and changing the policy, changing how the society sees sex work and massage parlor. And Asian worker is very important. So one of the campaign we do is to end racism against the Asian massage parlor, right? So even like sex worker, as Francine said, sex worker have different identity, so that how some sex worker disproportionately affected and harmful, and so this is something we are fighting. So we also have a lot of campaign that make the voices of sex worker being heard. They are not traffic victim. We need our right. This is my work. I want to keep my work. We do the rally in Newmarket, to ask the government stop this racist policy. And very important message is Asian sex worker keep saying the police cannot make us safe. We need to come together to protect each other's safety. And I think instead of calling more police and policing and the help of the police, how the community can build the power and giving the rights is something important, so that like how the worker keep organized and fighting for the justice. And so the rally in Toronto during the Constitution Challenge to fight. And this is very important, not only fighting by sex worker, but also all the allies, all the people care about the right and safety of the sex worker need to come together. And so the other thing is we try to advocate the feminist group, the women organization, that you need to believe in women power, not police power. And so this is very important principle, that you don't give more power and resources to police. You give more power and resources to the sex worker. They can defend themselves. They can protect their own rights. And so support full decriminalization of sex work and support status for all, right? For those do not have immigration status, they said that I would rather suffer the violence because I don't want to risk of losing my immigration status. And so giving the immigration status is also the other powerful way that people can protect their own safety. And so now Butterfly is working with many groups to looking at the transformative justice, right? So instead of having prison and police as a solution, we know that this is not the way to make racialized people, sex worker, trans community be safe, so that how we can develop different strategies, different way like to make ourselves safe. And so Butterfly have like create some online training. So I will put in the checkbox so that you can access some of our training and information. And please support the sex worker right, full decriminalization of sex work, and stop the harm of anti-trafficking policy and support status for all. And this is very important that you can do and support sex worker community to stop the violence and make sex workers safe, and particularly stop the violence from the state, stop the violence from the anti-sex worker organization. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Elene, I particularly, I learned this whole business of the way in which Asian and migrant sex workers face a slightly different or extra challenges. I think it's good for all of us to hear about that in such a passionate way. Our next speaker is equally as passionate as are all of our speakers, Sandra Wesley. Sandra is the Executive Director of Stella, L'Ami de Mamie, a Montreal-based organization by and for sex workers. They aim to improve the living and working condition of sex workers through direct services, education, and advocacy. Okay, Sandra, you're on.
Thank you. Hi. As Fran said, I'm Sandra from Stella in Montreal. I think my colleagues already covered a lot of material, so it makes it easier for me. So what I want to start with is simply just to come back to the point of this conference, which is talking about crime prevention and public safety. And how different people talk about sex work in that context in different ways. As sex workers, for us, crime prevention and public safety means that we want to be able to work safely. We want to be able to not be victims of violence. We want to not be victims of state violence. We want to have good working conditions. We want to be able to access labor protections. So those are the types of things that come to mind as sex workers when we think about safety. However, for the rest of society, conversations about safety and sex work tend to be about protecting society from our existence and eradicating sex work. So that's why we'll see, for example, in the program for this conference, there's a section about various issues, and it frames sex work as a social problem. And talks about, all the bad things that might have happened to someone to get them to do sex work and all of the difficulties to make someone exit the sex industry. So if we're starting from that framework, then we're talking about two completely different things. And it's impossible to have a conversation about sex workers' safety without acknowledging that sex workers should have a right to exist, and that our eradication should not be part of any conversation. And I know a lot of people want to be able to hold those two ideas, that you can protect sex workers and you can eradicate the sex industry, but you have to pick one. I think it's important to not allow anyone to think that there's this middle ground that might exist where those things can coexist. So Stella, we're primarily a service provision organization. We're run by and for sex workers, which means that our membership who can vote are sex workers, our board is majority sex workers, and same for our staff. What this means is that we know the realities of our industry. We have shared experience with the participants that we serve. And we provide a wide range of services, some that have to do with violence, some that have to do with STIs, and a lot that have to do with just everyday living things, housing, work, relationships, anything that sex workers need in their lives. We're there to support them and accompany them through this. When we provide services, we do not collaborate with police at Stella. We're in a very different context in Montreal than in Victoria, for example, where you've heard that there's been enough trust built with police that they can have an officer that they're in touch with. Here at Stella, Montreal Police is very much invested in the idea of eradicating sex work and is heavily funded with this in mind. Even though they've shifted to see us more as victims than as perpetrators, it's still a very repressive context, and it wouldn't be good for our relationships with the community or for the community for us to collaborate directly with police. Instead, what we do, we have a team of outreach workers who will accompany someone when she wants to go to the police or when she's forced to interact with the police. And we'll do that based on what the person wants. Sometimes that means identifying ourselves as coming from Stella and accompanying the person in that way. It might involve trying to get in touch directly with certain investigators that we might have had, not so bad experiences with before. And sometimes it means just being with her and not identifying ourselves, just saying we're a friend, we're accompanying her, and not naming that we're from Stella. And sometimes it also means preparing her for interaction with police and debriefing with her after, but not physically going. So everyone will have a different approach to this, because identifying ourselves as sex workers to police is dangerous. And identifying ourselves as sex workers who are empowered enough to seek the support of a sex worker organization can be very positive. It can also be negative. It depends a lot on the situation. So besides offering services, we also provide information to sex workers and also to other community members. We produce a lot of tools. A lot of it is about explaining to people who are actually criminalized what the law actually says, what their rights are, and finding ways for people to cope with that in their lives. Sometimes there are resources that will simply tell people, you have rights, cops can't search you without a warrant, or cops can't do this, cops can't do that. But when you're marginalized and face-to-face with police, you know that that's not true. You know that rights are not actually respected in those circumstances. You know that you don't always have the option of claiming your rights and fighting for them. So we, instead of giving people direct advice as to what to do, we provide people with questions to ask themselves to better prepare for those encounters with police. And we do the same for other topics as well. It's always about empowering people. And what that means is letting them do a lot of the thinking about their own personality. You know, are they someone who will be very calm in the face of a crisis? Are they someone who will feel that they have to talk? Will they start crying? What's their biggest concern? For some people, being arrested is not necessarily the end of the world, but being late to pick up their kids would be a big problem. So people will negotiate this violence from the state based on their own circumstances. As with other organizations, we have a bad client list and aggressors. We provide information in terms of violence prevention and will accompany women who've experienced violence, the majority of which do not want to report to police. Most of the time, the need that will be expressed is either to have some support, just someone to talk to, or to make the violence stop. And a lot of times when the person sits down and analyzes their situation, contacting police will not be a solution that goes towards that goal. It might be, there might be other things that the person will choose to do to make the violence stop if it's an ongoing violent situation. And then finally, the other big thing that we do is advocacy. So we fight for decriminalization. We also fight for all kinds of other policy change. And anything that we can do in order to reduce barriers for sex workers to access services that they need, or to be respected a little bit more. And what's really important in the advocacy that we do is that because we also provide services, those two things are interconnected. The work that we do on the ground informs the advocacy work. And the fact that we do the advocacy means that we can tell people in the community that we're also doing something to help them, because very frequently we'll be faced with a situation that someone is experiencing where there is no solution. There's no actual way to resolve it. And so to be able to at least go and work to change those policies, that's one way that we can keep doing this work and continue to serve our community well. I want to talk a little bit about what others can do that are not sex worker-led organizations. So the first thing that I would mention is to understand harm reduction. Harm reduction is a popular term that a lot of people will use, but it's often misunderstood or sanitized in a certain way to just mean, providing condoms, or to just mean give needles to people. When in reality, harm reduction is a community-led movement that starts from an absolute rejection of criminalization as a tool to keep our community safe. The harms that we're trying to mitigate when we do harm reduction are in large part the harms of criminalization. And so when we start from that premise, then harm reduction starts to actually have meaning. Stella has published a document about harm reduction. I see that Elene has put it in the chat. We've done this in collaboration with Butterfly. It's a very interesting resource to help you think through what harm reduction actually means and what it means in the context of sex work, since it's a concept that's often more associated with drugs. The other thing is to take a position. there's this reluctance in a lot of either community organizations or institutions to actually put down on paper a position in favor of decriminalization, or even sometimes a position in favor of recognizing sex workers' right to work and to have human rights protected. And that's a very important step. It's important for sex workers to know that your services are maybe safe. And it's also how you can support the movement and how you can then think through everything that you do in your organization and make sure that it's in line with this position that you're taking. The other thing, and Elene has been quite eloquent on this, is to refuse to engage altogether with anything that has to do with exiting sex work, anything that has to do with conflating sex work and trafficking, and any other type of anti-sex work language, such as talking about all sex workers as victims of exploitation. Those things are hateful. When sex workers want to stop doing sex work, we don't call it exiting. We call it getting a different job. We call it moving on with our lives. It's not as dramatic as people make it out to be. And we do this work every day within our sex worker-led organizations without it being a goal for a specific sex worker. And it goes back to this idea of, are we trying to keep sex workers safe, or are we trying to eradicate sex workers? And as long as we're in that eradication mindset, then we're actually putting people in danger. And a lot of those programs are quite hateful towards sex workers, and they will try to teach us that, you know, all of our sex work experience was bad, make us accept that we're just victims and that we, you know, are broken people. And they will often try to steer us towards even more exploitative and problematic lines of work, where our skills might not be appropriate, where there's maybe high costs to access, such as if we have to spend thousands of dollars in training. So it often ends up putting sex workers in worse off positions than before. Instead, if a sex worker says, I don't want to do sex work anymore, the way to approach it is by asking her what she wants to do, asking her what are the skills that she's learned in the sex industry. There's so many skills that sex workers have, and that can be built from and put forward. And it should never be an issue of if she's going to stop right now, stop later, if she's going to ever go back to the sex industry. That's irrelevant to actual real life humans. Then it's important to make real life meaningful connections with your local sex workers' rights organizations. There's lots of them in Canada. In every city there's one. So make that connection and ask them and listen to what they have to say about the local context. Then the other big thing is to celebrate sex workers as valuable, important members of our communities. Sex workers are safer when all of the aggressors and violent people out there do not get the message every single day that sex workers are available for violence, that they do not get this message from the government that says we want to eradicate them, from cities that say we want to eradicate them, from feminist organizations that say sex work is the cause of patriarchy, from all these other messages that send a message to aggressors, not only that it's intellectually okay to target sex workers, but that they have the capacity, the logistical ability to do so, because we are marked for eradication. And I see the time, so I'm going to end on this. For us, we often talk about how it's the same women in our communities, not just sex work communities, but all communities, the same women that are the most at risk of arrest, detention, non-consensual contact with police. Those are the same women who are the most at risk of violence. So if there's any desire to talk about violence against women, sexual violence, domestic violence, any kind of violence, we need to recognize that the driving force behind a lot of violence is repression against women, that we are both and frequently victims of violence and maybe perpetrators of violence, that we can be the persons committing crimes and victims of crime. And when we start to remove this dichotomy of the victim versus the criminal, then we can actually get to the core of people's realities, people's needs, and have actions that are helpful. And that's partly why, as a movement, we're not generally very invested in very repressive policies against our aggressors either, because we know that a lot of them, especially if they're intimate partners or people from our street-based communities, that we're all kind of in this struggle together. And we're all victims of a system that's much, much bigger than us. So if we can really understand this, And then I think that's where solutions start to become apparent.
Okay, that sounds like you've finished up, Sandra.
Yes.
I want to thank once again very much our participants for all of the various ways in which they participated, both by asking questions as well as answering some of the questions that have come up from the floor. And I noticed there's quite a bit of information in the chat that both Elene and Sandra have put up, so I invite you to take a look at that. And I hope even if you didn't ask your question, that you did get some answers to whatever they might be, and that you go back to your communities excited about the kinds of things that you might be able to do to increase respect for sex workers, as well as the ways in which they can work more safely and more security and carry on, at least in the short term. And we'll keep fighting in the long term from where each of us stand. And I must say, I certainly enjoyed being in the thick of it today with my 4 different participants. It's been a while since I've been in touch with so many delightful sex work organizations all at once. And I want to thank Oishi as well for all of the help she gave us and gave me when we were helping to set up this session. So thanks again. It's been a wonderful hour and a half.